Chevy differ from GMC?
The logos.
Aesthetics,
It is slightly different.
logo, what else? There's the same company that makes both of them.
Most of their models are the same, aren't they? Just a different name? Or is that not true?
They're very similar. They typically, right, it's the same body, but they make some differences.
The GMCs, well, what I've noticed is the GMCs have a lot more features and stuff compared to the Chevy models.
I thought this was an easy example, apparently it's not, but yeah, so GMC is the higher end, so.
GMC and Cadillac.
What's that?
Cadillac.
Okay, and Cadillac would be even higher end, right? But you take, sort of a base model Chevy, and so like the Chevy Colorado, they do a version of that, GMC does a version of that called the Canyon, right? And that's more expensive, more features, leather, stuff like that. And so GMC is positioned a little bit upmarket relative to Chevy. And so obviously this is not positioning that's resonated yet with people. But they want you to think about GMC as high end relative to Chevy. What's a good example of positioning? So Apple is, but I feel like we talk about Apple too much.
Walmart compared to Target?
That's really good. Actually, we're going to talk about Target in a minute, but yeah. So how has Walmart's positioning kind of changed over time? Well, when people think about Walmart, what do they used to think, and what do they currently think?
They're looking for lower prices. They're always looking to be the cutting edge in price compared to where they were before.
So it used to be that the positioning was all American brand, right? And I don't know if you guys were alive after that, but it was very much like American products. The way people thought about Walmart was, you loved apple pie, the U.S. flag, and Walmart. Right? Those were the trinity of patriotism right there. And that's changed over time. Now we think about Walmart as just low prices, right? So that's positioning. Repositioning is where you change the public's image of a brand. You want people to think about that brand differently. And these terms are sometimes used interchangeably, but people often say rebrand when what they mean is reposition. Rebranding, we typically use that term for when a company will just change their name. There's a business in Cedar City that changed its name, a major employer in Cedar City that changed its name when it came here for a good reason. You guys know what Wecco is?
Oh, yeah.
Marco?
Wecco, yeah, you guys know what that is?
It's a factory out west that makes rocket fuel.
Yeah, any idea why they changed their name when they came here?
Because of Las Vegas 10 years ago.
Yeah, so what is that?
They had a big fire happen at their facility, and it pretty much it exploded and killed like a couple people and blew out like people felt it for miles.
Yeah, to call it a big fire might not quite do it just. It was a massive
You
explosion.
should show a video.
Yeah, I should. No, we get time. I don't know. I don't remember that, but they changed the name. I don't know how to search for that other name of the company, but it's a massive explosion. So nobody wants that company coming to their town, so they changed the name of the company, called it Wecco, and came here. Does that make you guys feel safe?
So would an example of repositioning be like what Buick is doing right now? I don't know if you've seen their recent commercials, but they're kind of saying like, we know that this is what I take from their commercials, like we know that we used to like have this old image, but these are the new Buicks. Like, would that be repositioning?
Yeah, oh, completely, that's it. Well, they're trying to reposition, and cars, it seems like it's really hard to reposition cars, but that's exactly what Buick is doing. They want it to be a cool brand that younger people buy. And I don't know if that's working or not. But,
Wouldn't that come as far as the Hyundai and Kia?
repositioning, so, yeah, well, yeah.
How's that position?
So they kind of were perceived as being really low quality, and that's changed over time. So I think that's probably a good example of repositioning. So Volvo, this is a good example of repositioning, or at least trying to reposition. So it's not hard to kind of understand their previous positioning. This one I think is New South Wales. I don't know. Does anyone, somebody explain this one here.
Aren't those all categorized as self-defense?
There we
So
go.
basically Volvo's supposed to be self-defense?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's like, this is all, their positioning is,
Or you could kill someone with a Volvo.
There's that
Either way.
combination.
yeah, it's either for self-defense or
As a
aggression.
weapon, yeah.
Good. No, so it's all about safety, right? And that's, and Volvo's been known as being safe and sexy. Does that work?
Oh, yeah.
Those two words don't even go together.
Safe and sexy.
Shame on you.
Well, adding the Y on the second word changes that. We were talking about that.
Safe and boring, right? That's kind of been Volvo for a long time. And this is something they've been trying for a long time to overcome this positioning of being like, just kind of a boring, car. And so this, one of their more recent models, and this is definitely better looking than this, right? We can agree on that. But Volvo, and so this has been part of their kind of attempt to reposition themselves from being super boring, safe car to being something. And they also did, they've done a bunch of movie tie-ins, including Twilight, which I know Ben is a huge fan. He's been talking about that nonstop. No, so they've been doing tie-ins with movies and stuff to try to appeal to a younger audience, right? That's part of their repositioning.
So I was wondering about VW and that whole scandal. Is that repositioning, albeit inadvertent repositioning? But is that still considered the same thing?
Well, so when you talk about, that's a good question. I mean, typically when you talk about repositioning, what you're saying is this is where we as marketers want to go. We want people to think about us this way rather than that way. That's kind of typically how we think about repositioning. So that, even though it does fit this idea of people changing how they think about a brand, that's not typically what we mean by that. Good question though. And Volvo's gonna be fascinating to watch, see how they kind of come out from that.
So are they going for luxury or are they going for just a normal car brand?
Volvo?
Yeah, like, cause I can't tell if they're trying to like compete with BMW or are they just trying to compete with Ford, like, where are they trying to reposition towards?
Yeah, I don't know. I think they are upmarket. I think they do want to compete with more. I think they want to be more BMW than Ford,
Okay.
especially if you look at the price points for some of their vehicles.
Back in Sweden, it's like always like a middle, medium, BMW and Mercedes are way above. But when they come abroad, they try to make it a luxury brand.
Oh, that's a great point. We're going to come back to this idea, which is when you go overseas, that's a great chance to reposition your brand because with Volvo, people who grew up with that have a lot of kind of baggage in how we think about Volvo, which is kind of boring. But for a foreign brand, it's easy to kind of position in a different country differently than you are positioned domestically. So Burberry, they were popular among quote hooligans. They were featured in a lot of rap videos, and they thought, this is not the way we want to go. We don't want people to think of this as streetwear, right? And so what did they do? They hired this lady, I can't remember her name. Yeah, exactly.
They just had Odell Beckham Jr. do like a big ad too.
Oh, did they?
I would know that. It's on my Twitter like 5 times.
So they were trying to appeal more to women, update the design and so forth, to kind of change, right? They didn't want it to be, streetwear. Who can talk knowledgeably about PBR?
Hipster view. College students view.
Well, now, why do you say that?
Because it's cheap and.
It's cheap and
Does the trick.
does the trick. So this is, so
When
that's
we
kind
define
of,
does the trick, what does that mean?
Gets you drunk.
Jeez. We're under a rock.
so it's really funny when you say it like does the trick. If you were to look at like Budweiser, you will never see Budweiser and somebody drunk in the same. They will not allow you to show that, right? So in a movie, if somebody gets drunk, it will never be a major beer brand. It might be Dos Equis or PBR or something, kind of a low-end brand, but just as far as Budweiser and Coors, they will not allow that to be shown.
Why don't you go to NASCAR?
What's the? Yeah, you have to actually see. Yeah, so if you were just to watch, if you were an alien up in space just watching TV, you would assume that Budweiser got nobody drunk. So this is PBR's kind of domestic positioning. This is their China positioning, which is super exclusive and high end. It's got the logo. It's $44 a bottle.
Are you successful in China?
It's different content, but it's the same label, right? It's the PBR, label, and so that's a good example. As Tim was mentioning, when you go overseas, that's a good opportunity to reposition, and that's what PBR did in expanding to China. They repositioned as super upscale, which is kind of funny to us. But. So in the 80s and 90s, Target and Kmart were kind of indistinguishable. People kind of just considered them more or less equivalent. How has Target repositioned themselves?
More expensive.
I would agree with whoever it was that said it earlier. Target's kind of like the high-class version of Walmart, I feel like.
No, yeah, they're a little more expensive. And what else? What have they done though to make themselves kind of stand out from Walmart?
Is it that popcorn? It's like $2 for popcorn and a large drink
At
Target.
Target, I
Yeah.
never.
That's really good.
Yeah, right when you walk in, it just reeks of popcorn.
Really?
You just migrate straight in there.
Yeah.
They got higher end
All right. See this?
higher end
All right. Hudson's got it. What is it?
higher end clothing lines.
Higher end clothing brand. So they got exclusive deals with this is Isaac Mizrahi and Massimo, and Target got exclusive deals with designers that the competitors don't have, and that moved them away from where it came. Their logos are similar too, but today nobody just there's a clear distinction between them. But at the time there wasn't, right? People kind of thought of them very similarly until Target repositioned themselves as more of a brand that people who care about fashion and appearance would shop at.
Did they redo their store layouts when they got those deals? Because I feel like just when you walk into a Kmart store, you can kind of feel that it's definitely below Walmart.
Yeah.
When you walk into Target, you're like, oh, that's not so bad.
Yeah, definitely part of their repositioning is changing the layout. It seems like Kmart's are a little bit dimmer too.
Oh
there's a lot of light in Targets, in a little bit wider aisles, which kind of lends itself to a little bit more of an upscale feeling. Old Spice. So Old Spice has been around for a long time. It's 70 years old. That's a long time for a scent to be around. My grandpa's been gone a long time, but I remember that was the scent that he wore, way back in the day. But obviously, preferences for scent change over time. And this original scent, in the 80s, this was a brand that only old people used. And so their repositioning is pretty obvious to you. Right? So how have they positioned themselves today? Buff shirtless dudes.
Yeah, that was.
So talk about segmenting here. Who do they target? Athletes? Who else?
Younger males. Yeah, 20 to 40-year-old males.
Yeah, young dudes, right? So they kind of took a weakness and made it a strength, which is they were only appealing to people who were older, and they repositioned themselves to be a brand that's more associated with youth than anything, right? So lots of kind of super odd advertisements, but stuff that appeals to folks who are younger. That's a good example of repositioning. All right, so Freudian systems, we're talking about Freud. Who can tell me something that you know about Freud? Like one of his kind of major ideas or something. What did Freud say?
Isn't if something's wrong with you, it's because you weren't loved properly when you were younger?
Yeah.
It's like the main, like that's his go-to argument was people didn't love you enough or too much or.
Well, it not necessarily about love, but the idea that kind of early childhood experiences set the tone for later in life. That was certainly one of his ideas. What else? What else comes to mind when we talk about Freud?
Is it?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Was he the one that did the dog drooling experiment? That was
That's
someone.
Pavlov.
Okay.
Isn't Freud the one that like based everything off of sex?
Yeah, so sex is super important in Freud's kind of worldview. When you talk about kind of those early childhood experiences, a lot of those are, he calls them psychosexual development. So yeah, those are both spot on. What else?
The ego, right?
The ego, yeah. So ego, other idea.
It was about the unconscious, like if you said something wrong, you did that because you actually thought so.
Yeah, so this idea that we have an unconscious or a non-conscious, and that we're motivated by things we're not necessarily aware of. Okay, there's one other kind of big one that everybody usually gets right off the bat. Rhymes with penis envy. Penis envy. There we go. So penis envy.
Did you just not want to say the word?
He's embarrassed.
No, I was telling Professor Powell today that I average one penis joke a month in my classes. So, yeah, I can't make that one yet. I gotta make 4 a second. Was I talking about? Oh, sorry. Penis envy. His big mistake was to talk, was penis envy, and because it kind of colored everything that came after. This is usually people like to say they hate Freud, and in part because of this idea of penis envy. He was wrong about that. He's right about so much. The idea that your early childhood relationships set the tone for later in life. No question that's true. The idea that we're motivated in a non-conscious way by things that we're not necessarily aware of, including sexual motivations we're not aware of, definitely true. The idea of projection, that you see the world the way you are, not necessarily the way the world is. Defense mechanisms, all this stuff he was right about, but he was super sexist, and that was kind of why people hate his ideas today, right? But he was right 70% of the time. That's not a hard fact, that's just my estimation. All right, so Freudian, the idea of Freud's idea of personality is that it emerges from the conflict between gratification and responsibility. He had specific terms for these. Does anyone know? Roberto, I figured you'd know this one.
Ego, superego.
That's it. Has anyone heard these terms before? Id, ego, superego? So id, pleasure principle. Superego is your conscience or what you've learned from society and culture. So one kind of simple way of thinking about it is the id says go, superego says stop. Then you've got the ego, which sits between the id and the superego and sort of tries to mediate between these two forces. Any questions about this? So the id, pleasure principle, obviously this has to do with sex, but also kind of revenge, anything that's sort of, bless you, who was that? Wow. As I said, you can tell a lot about somebody by how they sneeze. All right, so marketing implications, it seemed, Freud's ideas seemed like devoid or removed from marketing, but there's actually more there than you might think. So you can kind of hide, so I think this idea is kind of fits this conflict between the id and the superego. These are 100-calorie brownie bites. So how would kind of Freud explain this?
It wants that sugar, that delicious stuff, but the superego's telling you you should eat something healthy, so create a super delicious, healthy brownie.
So this is a product that appeals to the id. It's delicious, right? It says go. Superego says no, you don't want to eat brownies. But this is a way to appeal to the id in a way that is acceptable to the superego. This is a United Airlines ad, and you can't really see it, but it's got, this is a little on the nose, but it's got the id on one side and the superego on the other, so it's like, you can drink, id, superego, you can get, it's business class, so it's like, you can appeal to the id by drinking, or superego, you got more room to work, that kind of stuff. So that's a way to kind of appeal to the id in a way that's acceptable to the superego. Christian Mingle, how does this work in Freudian view? Come on, Cody, what do you got for us?
I knew you were looking at me.
You got nothing?
I got nothing.
All right, Forrest.
Probably shouldn't mingle too much, no sex, because you're religious, but if it's Christian, then that's okay.
Yeah. So she's a babe, right? But so dating her might be unacceptable to the superego, right? Or trying to create an encounter with her might be unacceptable to the superego. Unless it's Christian Mingle, then it appeals to the id in a way that is acceptable to the superego. So kind of the grandfather of this approach is the guy named Ernest Dichter, who was a student of Freud. He was Austrian. Where are my Austrians at? There we go.
It's called Dichter.
That's what I said.
It's true, but it's okay.
That's what I said, isn't it?
Yeah.
All right, so he was a student of Freud, Austrian, and he fled, he sort of fled Austria when Hitler was coming to power, came to the US, and instead of doing psychoanalysis with patients, he went into what? Marketing, yeah. So I'll show you, he's kind of the master of this idea. You appeal to the id in a way that's acceptable to the superego. And as we talked about, Freud was a big fan of these ideas of non-conscious motivations, especially non-conscious sexual motivations. So his idea was appeal to the id in a way that that's acceptable to the superego at a conscious level. But that's directly appealing to the id. I'll show you a couple of examples. How do you say it again? Right on. So this one you can't find anymore. The Red Cross has kind of clamped down on these, but their first bunch of advertisements. So the problem that they faced at the time was that women were donating blood and men were very reluctant to donate blood. So the Red Cross wanted men to donate more blood. And so they went to, what's his name? Yeah. They went to that dude and said, help us out. And he said, okay. And he came up with a bunch of advertising designed to get men to donate blood. And like I said, you can't find these ads anymore, but the tagline was, give the gift of life. So how does that appeal to the id in a way that's acceptable to the superego? And why, and how is this appealing to men? Think like Freud. You gotta think like Freud here. Zito's got it. You gonna pass? I have to ask.
It sounds like sperm donation.
That's exactly it. Yeah. So that was his idea, right? So it's appealing to the id in a way that's acceptable to the superego, right? So that one's subtle. This one possibly a little less subtle. Esso is now Exxon, a company you've probably heard of before. How is this appealing to the id?
I want a tiger.
What's that?
I want a tiger.
Okay. The question is, do you want a tiger in your tank? And what does that mean? Just look at the image here.
Penis.
This tiger is.
It's clearly a tiger.
It's clearly a tiger. No, he's performing the physical act of love on this gas pump here, right?
Is that why his face is like that? I was curious.
Yeah, that's a no face.
That's a weird face.
Yeah.
Just saying.
Looks like I can't say whether this is like effective or not, but this was his plan, right? Appeal to the id in a way that's acceptable to the superego. One more, again, next one's gonna be super subtle, but you might be able to pick up on it.
Why you said it's subtle?
What do you mean?
I'm not sure.
This was 1938, right? 1938, this actually was subtle because we've changed a lot as a culture since 1938. 1938, people didn't really know what was going on here. Today, it's pretty obvious, like, what's going on. But this is another one of Ernest Steiger's creations. Any questions.
Did he use any other tactics that weren't sex related?
No, this was his game.
Okay.
Not, most of them are not like quite that
Okay.
over the top, but.
So he basically took any product made it sexual and they had to increase sex.
Well, it's hard to say if it worked or not, you know, because what's your comparison? It's hard to say if it really works or not. I'll tell you how it works, which is that I think it works very well as if you're an advertising agency and you're trying to drum up business, you can say, hey, we've got a way that's going to work. We're going to appeal, you know, we've got this Freudian idea. We're going to appeal to people's ids. This makes sense. It as an advertising pitch to a group of executives. I think that's how it works. I don't know if it actually works on people in the way that Deichter the way that he kind of had in mind.
Do you think that the lipstick advertisement was trying to appeal like to the guy because he was the one buying the lipstick for his wife or boyfriend or something?
Yeah, that does seem probably to appeal more to the fellas.
Yeah, because maybe like 1938 they assumed that it would be more the guys buying than wives or something.
Yeah, so, and there's kind of a history with this, right, which is, you know, most of the jewelry advertising that you see is geared to men. It's on, you know, shows that appeal to men more than women because that's who's doing the buying. Okay. So a couple criticisms. Doesn't work is one criticism. Works too well. There's a guy named Brian Key I'll talk about in a second. Of course, another criticism, it's overly sexual. But I think the whole idea is that it works as an effective pitch in a boardroom to a group of executives. This is how we're going to increase your sales, right? We've got this way to kind of get around people's objections. We're going to go right to the id and appeal to that. So as kind of word got out about Deichter's approach, there was a guy named Brian Wilson Key who wrote this book, Subliminal Seduction, where he took some kind of legitimate concerns about Deichter's approach and just ran with it and then just never stopped running. And so, are you being sexually aroused by this picture? Anybody want to admit to this? No? Nobody? Got one yes, thanks Cody.
What was his first name?
It's Wilson Brian Key. So he had this idea, which again kind of emerged from Deichter's kind of super sexual approach. And so this guy that came after him was super alarmist and saw sex in everything. So apparently there were supposedly breasts in ice cubes in some advertising, and but there actually wasn't. But he kind of perceived that they were there. In this book, he claimed that Ritz crackers had the word sex written on them.
Now I can't eat a cracker.
Can you see it?
No.
Trying to.
And you see it now? So he took this idea and just made a fool of himself with it. But again, he actually had a point, which is that advertising was very sexual in a non-conscious way. But he saw it in everything, including lots of places where it wasn't. All right, that's it for what's going to be on your upcoming test. But the good news is,
Can I ask a question real quick?
I'm not done talking. Yes.
Oh, cool. So is this Ernest Deichter's, is his, the way he works, is it similar to what Carl's Jr. did? Or are they practicing the same thing?
With Carl's Jr., there's no super ego. It's just right to the end. So kind of the idea of Deichter is it was subtle enough that it was subtle enough to appeal to the end in a way that wouldn't raise objections from the superego. And like that lipstick ad today, obviously that doesn't work.
Yeah.
But it's a different time, so you kind of have to imagine a different time where that wouldn't have raised the kind of eyebrows that it does today.
Okay.
But, I mean, isn't there a certain amount to be said for like Burger King because of the change in society? Where like, you know, if they had that same ad 30 years ago, it wouldn't have worked at all. Like, people would be probably like totally revolted because it was ridiculous.
Which
And
ad?
The Burger King ads, that's what he was talking about, right?
Carl's Jr.
Oh, Carl's Jr.
Carlos Jr., yeah, yeah.
Oh, yeah,
Like 20 years ago, like the super ego would have been like,
yeah.
this is terrible and we're not going there.
Exactly, yep. That wouldn't have worked back then. Yeah, the super egos have taken a backseat in recent years. So you can work on your projects for a few minutes, or I can talk about temporal discounting. Who says projects? Raise your hand.
Cool.
Who says temporal discounting? All right.
Maybe everyone else is just way more prepared.
So we're going to talk about impatience, time, and Burger King. It's not in that order. So this will not be on the test Thursday and Friday. This will be on whatever comes next. Has anyone seen this term before, Homo economicus? So this is the idea that, and this is taught for a long time in economics courses, that this was kind of the model of human behavior that economists used for a long time, which is that people are rational and they pursue their goals in a rational way. And one way to describe this would be, do you want $1 today or $1.01 tomorrow? How would Homo economicus respond to that?
Dollar today.
Oh, rational, that would be $1.01.
I would say dollar today because 1 cent's not that much now. I don't know if you're gonna even be there tomorrow or if you're just making fun of me or something. So I feel like give me $1 now.
That's a very rational response, but it's not the Homo economicus response. Homo economicus is completely rational. When you think about this, you think about how a computer or a robot would respond, right? So a computer or a robot's not going to worry about it whether you're, making fun of them. They would just say that it's more. I'll wait. So Homo economicus would say, if $1 today or $1.05 in a year would take the $1.05, right? Just because that's more rational. Of course, that's not how people actually behave, but this is kind of the idea. This is the perspective that traditional economics had for a long time, that people were very rational. Another definition: irrational behavior in a way that goes against one's narrow self-interest. So narrow self-interest is important here because, give you an example. Has anyone found someone else's wallet and then turned it in? Few of you. Did you take the money out first?
I looked and then I decided not to.
How much was in there?
It was like 110.
Like 110?
Yeah.
Way to go, man.
Thanks.
How come you always find people's wallets that are richer than you?
It's like God's twisted game. It's like it's good at you, but you don't worship him.
Yeah, I lost my wallet once in Salt Lake, and it had to be $40 in it. And the guy called me, tracked me down, and came to his house. And this guy he was Mexican, barely spoke any English, and lived in an absolute dump. And called me and gave me my wallet back with $40. This seemed like a guy who could probably use $40, right? That fits the definition of irrational behavior. And that's not a slur on that behavior, obviously it's good behavior, but it goes against one's narrow self-interest. So in the narrow sense, you're better off having money, right? And so not all irrational behavior is negative or bad. We just say it's not necessarily in your narrow self-interest to return money that you found. You compare that with self-defeating behavior. This is any action by which you bring failure, suffering, or misfortune on themselves. So, what are some examples of self-defeating behavior? Stuff that people do that makes their lives worse.
Smoke drugs.
Smoke what?
Meth.
Smoke meth, good example. What else?
Wouldn't this be true for like any type of addiction?
Yeah, any type of addiction I
Like
think would
shopping
fit.
addictions or
What?
I said shopping addictions.
Shopping addictions, yeah. So spending, obviously, spending a ton of money that you don't have, that could be self-defeating. Gambling, right? That could be self-defeating. Drug use, procrastination's another one, right? You put off what you should be doing.
Is this also the thing where you, in order to punish someone else, you punish yourself also? Like, where you could both have 50 cents, but instead
Oh,
everybody
yeah.
gets money?
Yeah, that would be a good example of that, yeah. Yeah, so you sort of burn yourself to burn somebody else.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I kind of mentioned this. This is these cheerleaders shave their heads for charity. Would we say that's rational? Would we say that's self-defeating? Would we say that's irrational? How would we categorize this?
I'd say rational.
Is it in their narrow self-interest to be bald? No. So we cross off rational, right? Have they brought shame or misfortune upon themselves?
No.
So we call this irrational, right? Because it's not in their narrow self-interest, but it's also not damaging to themselves, right? They're doing something that's beneficial for other people, and possibly for them down the road, right? As far as building character or whatnot. But in the narrow sense, right? Most women are better off with hair than bald. We'll come back to, so this is, again, we kind of talked about this rationality assumption. This is the homo economicus idea. People will be rational. And Freud had this other idea, which he called the death drive. Anyone know what this is called? Get a fancy word for this. Close.
Fetus.
Thanatos. Yeah, right on. Yeah, so that's the death drive. And kind of to put this in context, he was a physician working in the aftermath of World War I, which had some of the worst mental and physical injuries of any war. At the time, people didn't understand the concept of rotating deployments, and so you just were on the front line until you died. They didn't rotate, so people were on the front lines for years, right? And so the damage psychologically was horrific and physically was awful. And so, as a physician, he just saw the worst kinds of damage that other people can inflict on others. And so he had this idea that people were driven to death, which is just the exact opposite of the rationality assumption, which is that you pursue things rationally, and Freud kind of had this other view, which is everybody is driven to the grave. Just kind of a dark thing, but so in reality, their truth lies somewhere between the rationality assumption and the death drive. And I think I'm just gonna. You're gonna have to wait to know the truth. I know it's a great teaching technique.